Chris with Tampa Hillsborough County Public Library, and welcome to tonight's program. And now I'm going to stop talking and hand things over to Allison, our librarian. And take it away, Allison.
Hello, thanks everybody for joining us today as part of our 6th annual Family Heritage Festival. My name's Allison. I'm here with the Florida History and Genealogy Library, and every year we put on this festival, and it's a really good opportunity to celebrate Family History Month and bring people together to learn about these interesting topics. Definitely be sure to check out the other events on our webpage at that hcplc.org/familyhistory. I know Denise has another presentation on Saturday that you wouldn't want to miss. So we can move along. This is just a little book shout out. You can access this book, DNA and Family History, from Overdrive with your library card online. So some good information about how genetic testing can advance your genealogical research, and lots of other great books on Overdrive too. So today I'm happy to introduce Denise Manning, who's here to talk to us about DNA and ethnicity. Denise has a BA in History and an MA in Library and Information Science from the University of South Florida. She works at the Tarpon Springs Public Library, where she facilitates a monthly genealogy group. And as a volunteer, she also co-facilitates the DNA groups for the Pinellas Genealogy Society at the Largo Public Library. She also enjoys researching her own ancestors from Scandinavia and the British Irish Isles using both traditional and DNA research. And we're happy to have her. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Denise.
My name is Denise Manning, and I'm so happy to be with you guys tonight. As Allison said, I work at the Tarpon Springs Library, but I also volunteer for the Pinellas Genealogy Society. And I love talking about all things genealogy, so thank you for inviting me, and let's get started. Today we're going to focus on the 2 key deliverables provided with an autosomal DNA test. And we're going to briefly also in a couple of slides look at the types of DNA for genealogical purposes. But tonight we're going to focus on the 2 main deliverables with an autosomal test. And one is the ethnicity estimates. And I've got quite a few examples using my own family and friends. We're using ethnicity examples tonight from family tree DNA. Now, the second key deliverable with an autosomal DNA test is the cousin matching, and that we're going to talk about on Saturday. So, cousin matching to me is the most important aspect or deliverable, but ethnicity is all kinds of fun. So we're gonna spend some time tonight on that. Okay, I start most of my DNA lectures with a little bit about DNA and privacy. If you haven't yet DNA tested, you might have concerns about privacy. So there is some legislation in place to protect us testers from perhaps health insurance companies or employment, our current or future employment, to use our DNA against us. For example, I work for the city of Tarpon, not that they would, but they can't look at my DNA and go, she might have type 2 diabetes in the next few years. Let's fire her now before she gets expensive. That can't happen. And this summer, Florida became the first state to extend these protections to include life insurance, disability, and long-term care insurance. So there is legislation to protect us. Now, the best place to go for all updated information on genetic genealogy is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy at isog.org, and this is on your handout, isog.org. One thing I want to mention too, there's safety in numbers. According to ISOG, their wiki, recently I checked, the Ancestry database at ancestry.com of DNA testers is 18 million. The 23andMe database is 10 million. So there is a lot of people who have DNA tested. Now, Chris mentioned the handout that you'll find. I tried to hit the important stuff on the handout. In the upper right corner is the most important. It's my email address. If you have questions, if I can help, via email, I am happy to. So you'll find my email address. Okay, quickly, we're going to talk about the types of DNA tests used for genealogy. There's 4 types of DNA used for genealogy purposes. And it all starts with this little picture. Do you remember from 9th grade biology? This is a picture of our cell, and every single one of our cells has, in the cell nucleus, has 23 pairs of chromosomes. Half of each pair comes from dad and half from mom, and that's all here in the green center of that cell in the cell nucleus. Now, the chromosome pairs 1 through 22 are the autosomes, thus autosomal DNA. The 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes. Sons get a Y chromosome from dad and an X chromosome from mom. Thus, only males have Y DNA. Daughters receive an X chromosome from both dad and mom. But one thing I do want to stress, you guys, you do have an X chromosome, but it only came from mom. So if you have X chromosome or X DNA matches, it's only going to be mom's side of the family. X DNA matches appear in results from some companies, not all companies. Mitochondrial DNA, that's the DNA on the outside of the cell nucleus. And both males and females have mitochondrial DNA. We got it from mom. As an example, my brothers and I have identical mitochondrial DNA that we got from our mom. But I passed our mitochondrial DNA onto my children, but my brothers did not. My nieces and nephews, my brother's children, have mitochondrial DNA from my sisters-in-law. So we females pass it on, males do not, but you have the same mitochondrial DNA that your sisters do. Now, autosomal DNA, those chromosomes 1 through 22, is tested at these popular testing companies. Now, Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, we've all seen the commercials on TV. Maybe we're not aware of MyHeritage, Living DNA, and Family Tree DNA, but they are great companies, and you might want to think about those. Living DNA is the newest company. They're the newest kids on the block. They're still building their database, so their database isn't real big yet, but they're a great company and they're coming along. Now, the Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA that I talked about is only available through Family Tree DNA, but they also test autosomal DNA as well. Now, there are other companies out there testing, but if you're new, stick with these 5. These are the ones with the biggest databases, and we'll talk about more of that on Saturday with cousin matching, but it's all about the database. So stick with these. Now, this picture, I made this picture. I call it my ant people because the top row, the ancestors look like ants up there. But this is my family, this is your family, this is everybody's family. And the reason I did this is first to explain autosomal DNA inheritance, but also to give us, I love visuals, to give us a visual of just how many ancestors we're talking about here. There's a lot of them. Now, I'll walk you through this picture. I think you can see my cursor. This bottom person is me, of course, and the next row up from the bottom are my 2 parents. The next row up is my 4 grandparents. The next, my 8 great-grandparents, 16 second grades, 32 third grades, and 64 fourth great-grandparents. That's a lot of people. You can also see that the left half of the page is blue and the right half of the page is yellow. The blue signifies dad's side of the family. The yellow is mom's side of the family. So you can just kind of see just how many ancestors we're talking about. Now, with autosomal DNA inheritance, we inherit about 25% of our autosomal DNA from our 4 grandparents. Now, I say about because we might inherit maybe a little bit more DNA, maybe 30% from this grandpa here, and then only 20% from this grandma here. We get exactly 50% from each parent, but when we get to the grandparent level, it's about 25%. We inherit about 12.5% from our great-grandparents, about 6.25% from our second grades, as you can see, 3.13 from our third grades, and 1.457 from our fourth grades. As you can see, the amount of DNA we inherit from each of these ancestors is cut in half at each generation as we go further back in time. So when we get up here to this fourth great-grandparent level, we're only inheriting about 1.5% from each of these ancestors. And in actuality, we might not inherit measurable DNA from some of these people. And why can that be important? Now, I work in the library and we get lots of questions. And one question I receive often is someone will come in and say, well, Denise, there's been a story in my family for generations that we have a Native American ancestor. And I took a DNA test and it shows no Native American ethnicity, no Native American DNA. Does that mean that this was just a story in my family and there's no truth behind it? And I say not necessarily. You definitely could have a Native American ancestor, but it might be far enough back in your family tree that you didn't inherit measurable DNA from that particular ancestor. It doesn't mean that person is still not your fourth or fifth great grandparent, and it doesn't mean that person's not Native American. You just didn't inherit measurable DNA from that person. However, you could have a sibling who has inherited enough DNA from that ancestor to be measurable on a DNA test, or you could have a cousin on that side of the family who could. We'll talk about that a little more because you say a sibling. How could a sibling have different DNA than you? But they do. So we're going to talk about that too. But in spite of the limitations of autosomal DNA, only going back about 4 or 5 generations, it's still a very, very powerful tool for genealogy purposes. For example, my brothers and I were born in the 50s. Our grandparents were born at the turn of the 20th century, give or take a few years. And our third great-grandparents were born at the turn of the 19th century, give or take a few years. So you can see it's still, in spite of the limitations, it's still very powerful and still goes back very, very far. So I think I've covered what I wanted to on this page. I think the most important thing is the visual of just how many ancestors we have. Now, also too, I want to point out with ethnicity is, say there's a story that grandma was German. Maybe you grow up knowing grandma was German. She cooked lots of German foods and the family culture was German. Well, grandma's got a lot of ancestors too, as you can see. And so maybe there's some ancestors back there on grandma's German side that maybe were more from Eastern Germany, maybe more like Poland, maybe as far east as the Ukraine. Even though you grew up knowing grandma was German, maybe she wasn't completely German. So keep those things in mind as we move forward, that we're not just talking about our grandparents. We have a lot of ancestors. Okay, so we've reviewed the different types of DNA. We have kind of an idea that it's the autosomal DNA we're talking about, those chromosomes 1 through 22. And we have an idea of just how many ancestors we're talking about. So let's talk about ethnicity. That's all kinds of fun. I'm sure you recognize these two faces. They're the face of 23andMe selling DNA kits on TV and the face of Ancestry selling DNA kits. And these guys have sold a lot of DNA kits. And so hats off, they have sold a lot of kits. And that's what it's all about. They're building the databases. So now this is my ethnicity estimate from Family Tree DNA, and I am predominantly Scandinavian. I'm about 3/4 Scandinavian, and the rest of me, that last quarter, is a mix of Irish and English. Now, Family Tree's latest ethnicity update, and we're going to talk about ethnicity updates too, their latest update doesn't show my English, which is predominantly colonial American. I have one great-grandmother whose all the branches go back to New England in colonial America. One's a little Palatine German, one branch, but I think predominantly they're English. But I don't know with Family Tree's update. I'm a little disappointed. I don't see the colonial American. Am I frustrated? No, because one thing I do want to emphasize is that this is brand new science. Autosomal DNA being used for genealogical purposes is only about 10 years old. So as you guys can imagine, this is brand new science. And that's why I say hats off to the guys who are advertising on TV for selling kits, because as these databases grow, as more and more people DNA test, it's helping to refine the science. So I know another upgrade will be along, and I'll probably be happier with that one. But the most important, very most important thing that I want to stress with an ethnicity estimate is when we mail in our DNA test in the little bubble envelope, they're comparing our DNA with test populations living today. Now, those two words alone, test population, scream estimate. But it's important to remember, they're comparing our DNA to test populations living today and not with our ancestors' DNA. Nobody's digging up any ancestors. They're comparing our DNA with test populations. And who are those test populations? Those are the people like you and I who have DNA tested. That's why the bigger these databases can become, the more refined the science can be. And maybe they will become more and more specific down the road. But also keep in mind, they will probably always be estimates. For example, here we see a map of at least Western Europe. Now look at all of those country borders. That has a lot, those borders have a lot more to do with 20th century politics than they do with ethnicity. So when you think about German and Polish and Austrian, they're all very close together. Look at Norway and Sweden. I'm predominantly Norwegian, but I'm a little bit Swedish. So keep all that in mind as you're looking at ethnicity estimates. That biggest reason they're comparing our DNA to test populations, not directly with our ancestors. If they were comparing our DNA with our ancestors, they'd probably be pretty spot on. But all the ancestors are safely buried where they've always been. Now here I'm using my Uncle Pat as an example. And the lesson on this slide is if you have a family member from an older generation. You younger people probably still have your parents and aunts and uncles. Take advantage of that. Coax your older family members, the older generation, to DNA test, because it can be very, very valuable. Now, with my ethnicity, I'm predominantly Scandinavian, as I said, and I'm 25%, which is a mix of English and Irish. Predominantly. My Uncle Pat, who's my dad's brother, I lost my dad before DNA got to be popular, but Uncle Pat's a good sport. Uncle Pat and my dad are half Norwegian and half English and Irish. Now, surprisingly, Uncle Pat's updated estimate doesn't show Irish, and it really should. And the picture could be painted that because Uncle Pat's a generation closer to the ancestors, that's perhaps why the English shows up more than I don't think that's the case here, especially because his Irish doesn't show up. I think it's that those test populations between the United Kingdom and Ireland are probably so close that the testing company has a hard time differentiating who's English and who's Irish. And think about that. Now say I was all Irish. Am I 100% Irish because all four of my grandparents were born in Ireland? What if one of my great grandmothers was born in England? Am I still all Irish? So keep that in mind, that there's so many variables with these ethnicity estimates. And like I said, I think in this case, the ethnicity between English and the United Kingdom and Ireland is just kind of intertwined, and they've been migrating back and forth for forever. So they're probably just having trouble. But like I said, with we talked about the Native American ancestry. If you have an older family member, they might show a particular ethnicity. They might show more than yours does. So keep that in mind. Okay, now I'm throwing my brother Jim in here in the mix. Now remember I had said that perhaps a sibling could show a particular ethnicity that doesn't show up on yours. And yes, that could happen. Jim and I, same mom, same dad, we should have identical DNA, right? It's not identical. And the reason is, think of a pot of stew. Well, I'll backtrack a little bit. Okay, my brother's older than I am. So when my brother was conceived, he got a mixed up 50% of our dad's DNA and a mixed up 50% of our mom's DNA. I came along a few years later and I got a different mixed up 50% of dad's DNA and a different mixed up 50% of mom's DNA. I get back to my pot of stew. We've all scooped into a pot of stew, and that first scoop might be one piece of meat, one potato, and a couple of carrots. And the second scoop might be two pieces of meat, two potatoes, and only one carrot. As you can see, same pot of stew, but each scoop is a little different. That's why when you look at these tests, I know some people have been frustrated saying my sister's test is so different than mine. My sister's ethnicity estimate is so much different than mine. And they feel frustrated and they feel that, that perhaps the DNA just isn't accurate at all. Now, it is, but we have to keep these things in mind, that with these ethnicity estimates, there's going to be variations, and there's a reason why full siblings can have slightly different ethnicity estimates. And when we understand this, it starts to make more sense. Now, before I go on, I do want to say that in some parts of the world, the test populations are quite large. Of course, DNA testing is terribly popular in the United States. I don't think we can watch TV in an evening without seeing a DNA commercial. It's also very popular in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and also in the Scandinavian countries. DNA testing is very, very popular, only a couple steps behind the United States. So those test populations are enormous. And when the test populations are that big, the results are pretty accurate. They've got a whole lot of people to work with, and the results are pretty accurate. But some parts of the world, and as we're going to look at in my next slides, some parts of the world, it just hasn't caught on. You can go online with your Visa card, no matter where you are in the world, and buy a DNA test, but it perhaps just hasn't caught on. Now, working in the Tarpon Springs Library, we have lots of Greek patrons, and I wanted to kind of stay ahead of the questions, and so I coaxed Irene, my coworker who's half Greek, to DNA test. And I coaxed her because I wanted to see how her Greek ethnicity would show up on a DNA test so that I'd have a little bit of answers for people that come into the library. Now, Irene is half Greek. Her mom is mainly English and German. So where you see the United Kingdom and Germany, but now remember Germany, there wasn't a Germany until 1870. It was all made up of these Germanic states that went all the way from close to France to into Poland. Remember, Poland was Prussia. So when you think of German ethnicity, it really covers a lot of ground. And that's why when you see her mom's German ethnicity results covering parts of France and through Poland and even into the Ukraine. And this is probably all her mom. Now her dad is Greek, and her dad is first generation from the tiny island of Sini in the Dodecanese Islands. If you've hung out at the Sponge Docks in Tarpon, you're probably familiar with the Dodecanese Islands. Sini is under this red spot I put here. All of the Dodecanese actually are under my red dot, but I wanted you guys to see it. That's where Irene's dad's from. Now, as far back as she's researched, which is quite a few generations, everybody's from Sini, this tiny little spot. So how come her ethnicity estimate from dad's side of the family goes all the way from Portugal and Spain, across Italy, across Greece, and into Turkey, the entire Mediterranean, for crying out loud? That's because the test population for Greece is very, very small. So they're kind of lumping it together with all those other folks that are from the Mediterranean. So as you can see, the results for her Greek ethnicity is kind of general and kind of disappointing if you don't understand that some test populations are small. And it's just because it just hasn't caught on in Greece. You know that guy that we just saw that had to give up his lederhosen and buy a kilt? He's probably not on TV in Greece, unfortunately. So anyway, when you understand the limitations, then you can look at this and not feel quite as disappointed if you have more general ethnicity results. Again, the test populations are growing every day. As more and more people test, perhaps these regions of the world where the results are kind of general, they'll probably improve. Now, one thing with Irene's results and with some, you get these tiny little percentages, like less than 1% or 2%. They come with this little I button. If you click on that I, it says that they're so tiny, they say that it's misattributed ethnicity, but yeah, misattributed is just kind of a fancy word for noise. So if you have some tiny, tiny little percentages, I wouldn't spend a lot of time looking for ancestors from those parts of the world. It's probably just margin of error. Okay, my friend Treva, all of these people were good enough to offer their ethnicity maps to me for a presentation. My friend Treva is predominantly African American, and you can see that yeah, they've kind of specified Nigeria. Most of her ethnicity is from Nigeria, but she's picking up ethnicity estimates from other parts of Africa. Once again, is this real helpful for genealogical purposes? Probably not. It's a lot of fun. The ethnicity part is a lot of fun. How really helpful it is for good old-fashioned genealogical research? Yeah, probably not so much. Now, my daughter-in-law, Jen, I'm using her map here. Jen's dad is from Colombia. Now, her mom is predominantly English and Irish and a little bit of some other parts of Europe, but that's her mom's DNA showing here. Her dad is from Colombia, and what we know of a lot of people in South America, especially Jen's dad, he is made up of Spanish ancestors, and Native American ancestors. And so this we're seeing here is Jen's dad's Spanish heritage. And then here is his Native American heritage. And as you can see, the Native American heritage is extremely broad, all the way across North and Central and South America. And her dad is from Colombia. So once again, some ethnicities are just coming across really, really general, but it will improve as the test populations grow. That's why I get excited as more and more people DNA test, because it's all helping the test populations grow and the science to get more specific. Now, I have tested with all 5 companies. And so one of the last questions I get in the library is, how come I got one estimate from one company and a different estimate from another company? It's the same DNA. And I say, you're absolutely right, it's the same DNA. The difference is each company has a different test population made up of their DNA testers. They also have a different algorithm for crunching the numbers. Now, the good news is they're all in competition. They're all trying to build a better mousetrap. And so for us consumers, that's good news. They're all trying to do it a little bit better. So I'll walk you through this slide. There's a lot of information in one slide. Now, first of all, remember that picture of all the ancestors back a few slides when I say we inherit about 12.5% of our autosomal DNA from each of our 8 great-grandparents, but not exactly 12.5%. Well, for the sake of this slide, we're going to go with the 12.5% for me. So going with the 12.5%, my paper trail, I should be 62.5% Norwegian, 12.5% Swedish, 12.5% Irish, and 12.5% Colonial American, which is a mix of mostly English with a little Palatine German. That's what my paper trail says. As you can see, each of these 5 companies show my ethnicity as a little bit different. Now, we're going to start with ancestry. Remember how I said some of those neighboring countries, the ethnicity and the culture is so intertwined, it might be hard to separate. I never dreamed that a company would separate out my Swedish DNA from my Norwegian DNA. I thought that I would just be Scandinavian. Ancestry did. They cheated. I think they cheated a little. I'll be nice. I'm an Ancestry fan, so don't think I'm not an Ancestry fan. But what Ancestry does is it takes my ethnicity, all of our ethnicities, anybody who's tested with them, takes our ethnicity and uses it together with user-submitted family trees. Now, Ancestry didn't just look at my family tree and say, oh, she's got a Swedish great-grandfather, let's throw her in at 12% Swedish. They didn't do that. They say they use big data that they're using across all of the thousands of user-submitted family trees, but I still think that combining that with the science is cheating a little bit. The other companies are using strictly with the DNA and the test populations, not using family trees. So that's how Ancestry got my Swedish great-grandfather separated out from the rest of the Norwegians. Now, family tree DNA and the rest of them call me mostly Scandinavian. As you can see, I'm mostly Scandinavian with all of the companies. Now, I copy these ethnic categories, or whatever we want to call them, exactly from each of these testing companies. I didn't change a thing. And it's interesting, some of them, like Ancestry, uses the country, like I'm from Norway or from Sweden, where some of them, like 23andMe, uses it more like an ethnic culture, like I'm Scandinavian or I'm British or I'm German. That to me is interesting. Some of them lump together. Remember I talked about that British and Irish and me and Uncle Pat, and they were having trouble kind of getting that correct with this last ethnicity upgrade. 23andMe combines British and Irish. So as you can see, they're all a little bit different. And often people say, well, which one's correct? And my answer is they all are, because they all use different test populations and they all use different algorithms for crunching the numbers. So there you have it. You'll see a little bit different from each of the companies, and that's okay. And when we understand why we're seeing these differences, then we understand. Okay. I'm going to finish up with Facebook. Now, as a librarian, never in 100 years would I say study on Facebook, but I'm telling you to study on Facebook. My favorite books and blogs I've listed on your handout, but I can't say enough about the fun of learning on Facebook. Now, there's Facebook pages for everything genealogy, DNA, and I'm just throwing out a couple of my favorites here. DNA Newbie is wonderful if you're new at this DNA stuff. Genetic Genealogy Tips and Techniques is wonderful too, and actually it's my favorite one. But I want to say that maybe you want to start out with DNA Newbie for a while before you jump into that one. There's also some Facebook pages that are mixing DNA with geography, which I think is great fun. They're also mixing DNA with surnames. Once again, just play with search terms in the Facebook search spot. And I can't say enough about the fun. And what happens is people are asking questions. Other people, often the heavy hitters in the genealogy world, are answering the questions themselves. Otherwise, other genealogists like you and I are answering questions. You can participate, of course, but also sometimes, especially at night when I'm kind of tired, but I still, you know, my genealogy wheels are turning in my head and I want to read some stuff, but I'm kind of tired. Just reading some questions and answers on some of these Facebook pages is a great education and a lot more easygoing than trying to slog through a textbook. So, in conclusion, ethnicity estimates are lots of fun. Are they all that accurate in some spots of the world? Perhaps. In other spots of the world, not so much. But like I said, they're probably the most fun part of DNA testing. As we talked about, in some parts of the world with large test populations, they're pretty good. In other parts of the world, well, we're still waiting. Test populations continue to grow. And that's where, when I talk about ethnicity upgrades, that's what I'm talking about. Your ethnicity isn't changing, it's the same as it's always been, but as these test populations grow, the testing companies are updating their ethnicity estimates and they're bringing the databases along with, and so that's why we get ethnicity upgrades. The real value is in cousin matching, and that's what we're going to talk about on Saturday, so I hope you join me there. So I think we still have some time. I hope I didn't talk too long. I think we still have some time for questions.
All right.
Unshare my screen, Chris?
Yeah, I will change that over and you can turn your camera back on. And let me go ahead and take control of the screen.
Okay,
all
here
right.
I am.
That was great. Yeah, please submit your questions in the questions panel and we will get some answers for you. We have some time here. We do have one question already. It's about updates to results. Do the companies automatically provide updates to results or do they require retesting?
No, they just bring us along. They just bring us along in the database. There's no extra money. They're just bringing us along. And so test now. It's not like when you're waiting for the new technology to buy a new TV. No, test now because they'll bring it along. They're bringing us along.
I gotcha. All right. Someone wants to know, I guess it's about you and your Uncle Pat. It says your DNA would be different to your Uncle Pat's as you have half of your mom's DNA. Someone's asking that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Uncle Pat's DNA is valuable to me because it takes my mom out of the picture and I can just focus in on perhaps some mysteries I'm trying to solve on my dad's side of the family. So yes, that can be very helpful, and especially because he is a generation older than I am, he's a generation closer to the ancestors, so that can be very helpful. It's my Irish line that I have the most trouble with. I think most people do. My mysteries are on my Irish side, so I use Uncle Pat's DNA a lot because he's a generation closer to those Irish guys.
I gotcha. All right, our next question. It's about uploading to GED Match to avoid buying all 5 tests. Have you uploaded to GED Match?
Yes, absolutely. And what I do want to, and if you send me an email, if you're interested, because you don't have to individually test with all of the testing companies. Some of the testing companies, Living DNA, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage, allow you to upload your test results from other companies. So you could test with Ancestry or 23andMe and upload to those other companies. They charge, but it's much less than the cost of a full test. It's like $19.99 at Family Tree DNA and $39 at MyHeritage or something like that. But yes, there is a much more budget-friendly way to get in all of the databases, and I am happy to answer that with an email. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and Denise's email was posted to the chat section, but if you don't want to look there, it's ddmanning27@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
So feel free to copy that, and while you have time, we have another question here. Oh, someone wants to thank you for the clear info that you presented tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great presentation. So we have some more questions. Can these tests determine race, or is it just ethnicity?
You know, that's a good, it's a good question, because I'm not quite sure what's the difference. You know, you're matching up with people from different parts of the world, kind of based on that geography. And so I kind of look at them as one and the same.
Okay, our next question. Someone is talking, someone has 12.5% of their paternal grandfather has no Y DNA. So what is the mix from him? I guess someone's asking about.
Well, Y DNA we didn't talk about too much.
Right.
Y DNA follows the direct male line. Lots of people get that confused with dad's side of the family, and it's not. Y DNA isn't dad's side of the family. It's your direct male line. So for instance, my brother tested Y DNA, because I don't have any. My brother tested, and it follows my brother, my dad, his dad, my paternal grandfather, his dad, my paternal great-grandfather, that usually Y DNA follows a surname. So for instance, my maiden name is Crowley. Everybody in my Y DNA line has the Crowley last name. So it's not dad's side of the family, because there's a whole lot of other people over there, but just the Crowleys up the direct male line. Hope that helps.
Yeah. Following up on the previous question about ethnicity and race, race is usually associated with biology and linked with physical characteristics, and ethnicity is linked with cultural expression and identification. Just to,
okay, thank you for that clarification. Okay. But yeah, I guess DNA does that then, kind of both, because I think they're testing according to kind of geography.
Right. All right, well, we have time for a few more questions. Someone would like to know, how long have you been studying DNA in terms of ethnicity and other aspects? How long have you been studying this?
Since I'll tell you a little bit about, the first time I jumped in the DNA pool was, I think, oh my goodness, 2013 or 2014, so 6 or 7 years. And I was fascinated from the moment I got my test results back. I tested with family tree DNA first, and I was fascinated. And I'll tell you, before I went to library school, I was a history major. So I love all things history, and I was an English minor, so I can write good sentences too. I loved history and I can write good sentences, but science and math, forget about it. I sold my science textbooks right quick as the final test was over. And I have probably retained like enough fractions to bake cookies and balance my, enough math to balance my checkbook. But math and science is totally not my thing. And here now DNA is all math and science.
Yes.
I was fascinated. So I read everything I could get my hands on. That's the story.
Right. Well,
I'm still learning all of the time. Like I say, I coax people to test so I can see what their ethnicity estimate is going to look like.
All right. We have one more question that just came in here. They say, I'm female. Does that mean I have no DNA from my father's father?
No, you do.
Yeah.
Now you have no Y DNA. You have to borrow a brother or a cousin to get some of that. But you have your father's father, grandpa. You have about 25% of his DNA, but it's autosomal DNA. It's not Y DNA. It's this autosomal that I talked about that you can test with Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage. That's what you got from that grandpa.
All right. I think that is it for questions. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my slide here. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening and talking about it. Luckily, Denise is going to be presenting again on this coming Saturday at 2 p.m. The Putting DNA to Work session. She'll be leading that. And to find out more about all the events that are still coming, you can go to the website that Allison mentioned at the top of the program at hcplc.org/familyhistory. There's multiple events still on the schedule, so you can register for those. Check those out. Also, if you'd just like to contact the library, you can call us at the number here on the screen, or you can go online and contact us as well at hcplc.org/contact. And also, we have genealogy resources as well that you can look at online at hcplc.org/research/genealogy. Well, again, thank you so much, Denise. We look forward to seeing you on Saturday. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I hope you all have a great evening.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.